Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We have a country that devolves a lot of important powers to state and local governments. It's always been that way. It's part of the founders' design. And there's always a complex interplay between states, municipalities, the federal government. And one of the things that we allow state and local governments to do is administer elections. Now, it does create a weirdly complicated system compared to other countries. You can argue, though, that states know what is best for their voters, right, since they are closest to them. Now, the problem, of course, is that through much of this country's history, that power, that local power, was abused explicitly and primarily, but not exclusively, to stop black people from voting, to erect a one-party, minoritarian, authoritarian state throughout most of the American South. And so in the 1960s, after blood and sweat and tears and organizing, we came up with a grand bargain. And you know what it is. It's called the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act did not fully nationalize elections in this country, but it was an attempt to create a floor for the administration of those elections, as well as mechanisms of oversight to make sure that local election boards were not abusing the high levels of discretionary power that they had, levels of power they had used to effectuate and further white supremacy and anti-democratic exclusion. And it worked. It worked for nearly 50 years. It is one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history. Look at this chart of black voter registration in southern states. Now, the columns on the left, the little ones in orange, those are black voter registration levels before the law was passed. You can see Mississippi is just under 7%. The much higher columns on the right in green, those are black voter registration levels just 2 years later. 2 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. Look at that. And those new black voters elected black politicians to represent them. This chart shows the number of black Southern legislators. You can see before the Voting Rights Act, there were practically no black Southern legislators. Starting in 1965, that number steadily climbs. The law was largely embraced by members of both parties. For instance, when Congress voted to renew it in 2006, that bill passed the Senate by a vote of 98-0 and the House 390-33. That's as close to consensus as you get in American life. In fact, when Republican President George W. Bush signed the extension of the law, this is how he described it.
In 4 decades since the Voting Rights Act was first passed, we made progress toward equality, yet the work for a more perfect union is never ending. We'll continue to build on the legal equality run by the civil rights movement to help ensure that every person enjoys the opportunity that this great land of liberty offers. Today, we renew a bill that helped bring a community on the margins into the life of American democracy. My administration will vigorously enforce the provisions of this law, and we will defend it in court.
Again, that was just like canon for everyone, okay, at the time. We will defend it in court. We had gone a long way towards solving this particular problem, not all racial equity issues, but this particular problem, the targeted disenfranchisement of black voters, the use of local discretion as a tool of oppression and exclusion. And then just 7 years later, after that speech, Chief Justice John Roberts came in and he just broke it again. In 2013, a fringe right-wing movement, pairing with John Roberts and other conservatives on the Supreme Court, just destroyed the Voting Rights Act in a monumental case, claiming, more or less, racism was overdone, so what the heck are we doing here? It's important to remember, there was no grassroots rebellion against the Voting Rights Act. Removing it was not some huge pressing issue. There were some localities that wanted to do their own thing in the South, and there were some right-wing jurists. But getting rid of the Voting Rights Act, make no mistake, was a raw act of judicial activism. At the time, federal judge Richard Posner wrote about the decision, quote, Shelby County versus Holder struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act, the part requiring certain states with a history of racial discrimination in voting to obtain federal permission in advance to change their voting procedures called preclearance, as violating the fundamental principle of equal sovereignty, he quotes that, of the states. This is a principle of constitutional law of which I had never heard, for the excellent reason that there is no such principle. That's right. John Roberts just invented it. He invented the principle so he could do what he wanted to do, which was to break and destroy the Voting Rights Act, one of the most successful pieces of legislation in American history. And where do we find ourselves now, 8 years later? Look what Chief Justice Roberts has wrought. John Roberts took this completely effective way of balancing all these different interests, and he destroyed it because he just didn't like it. And nothing has risen up into this place. In fact, what we have now are a Republican Party that is further radicalized and is using their power in states and localities to do whatever they can to gain advantage. Take what happened just today in Arizona, where they are not just doing a phony forensic audit in an arena next to a circus. Today, Doug Ducey, the Republican governor of Arizona, signed a law that experts say will remove more than 100,000 voters, including 30,000 Latino voters, from the state's permanent early voting list. That means they will no longer automatically receive mail ballots. Now, here's the thing. Arizona was one of the states fully covered by the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act that were struck down. They would have had to get pre-clearance from the federal government to do this. What Arizona Republicans are doing with their bogus election audit is a PR stunt. What they did today is an attempt at real hardcore voter disenfranchisement. Democrats have voting rights bills in the House and Senate in an attempt to try to reset the balance, right? To fill the vacuum left by John Roberts and the conservatives in the court, the grand bargain that we had, that John Lewis shed blood for, along with thousands and thousands of others. At the markup of the Senate bill today, Democrats tried to sound a warning about these anti-democratic bills Republicans are pushing across the country. While Republicans trotted out bad faith arguments, it's really the Democrats who are trying to game the system for their own benefit.
We are witnessing an attempt at the greatest contraction of voting rights since the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow. Republicans no longer want to let the voters pick their politicians. They want to let politicians pick their voters.
The truth is quite simple. Our democracy is not in crisis, and we aren't going to let one party take over our democracy under the false pretense of saving it.
Our democracy is not in crisis. I mean, yes, we did have a violent insurrection whipped up by the last president, the first attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power in generations, possibly ever, depending on how you define it. But, you know, nothing to see here. And so now we're back to all this again. The pre-clearance bureaucracy of the Voting Rights Act was erected precisely to solve this problem. The one they're fighting over now. Thank you, John Roberts. We are not going to take this power away from municipalities. That was the idea behind the Voting Rights Act. But we're going to have oversight and a check against attempts to lock voters out of the process. Now, the only way to deal with this is to create some sort of new federal standards. But Democrats need 60 votes to pass that kind of bill, unless they kill the filibuster. Republicans have made it clear they are all in on making it as hard as they can to vote.